Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Iraqi Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi has voiced his support for the preservation of bilateral relations with his country's eastern neighbor, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Abdul Mahdi's efforts are made despite Washington's resistance to granting Baghdad special privileges amid American efforts to exert economic pressure on the Ayatollah regime since the United States pulled out from the 2015 nuclear agreement. To discuss the growing Iranian influence in Iraq and the implications on regional stability, I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Ronen Zeidel, who is an Iraq analyst at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Mr. Chris Mitchell, who is the CBN News Middle East Bureau Chief. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome Mr. Meir Javedanfar, who is an Iran lecturer at IDC Herzliya. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of the current chain of events pertaining to this specific topic.
Let's start with some breaking news. The Iran-Iraq war is over, and Iraq won. It's 30 years old news, but nevertheless, because of American involvement in what happened in the Iraqi war, Iran has won. 30 years ago, Iraq was victorious, but now the Americans have given Iran the victory. And at the midpoint of these 30 years, exactly 15 years ago, Saddam Hussein was captured by the Americans who have captured Baghdad, ousted him from power, and eventually in December of 2003 captured him, and then 3 years later he was executed. The upshot is that the Iraqi system of government has not been democratized, as the Americans hoped. Rather, it fell under the influence of Iran. And of course, there are many inputs into it, and we'll discuss them all. But the major fact of life in the Iraqi political culture today is that Iran, through its proxies, through its infiltration not only of the government but also of the security forces, is calling the shots in Baghdad.
Dr. Zeidel, to what degree, since Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi was elected and has, of course, his Shiite background as a strong backbone of his decision-making, as well as a strong influence of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, as well as the mobilization forces in Iraq, has brought the Iranian influence to a certain degree of power over Iraq, or is there something other than that?
Well, it's pretty more complicated than that, because Iraq now is split. And it's not the Iraqi split. The Shi'i sector, which is the majoritarian sector in politics, is split. And the political system is, to a large extent, deadlocked. You spoke about Adil Abdul Mahdi was elected. Adil Abdul Mahdi was not elected. He was nominated because the elected prime minister could not form a coalition. Now, the anti-Iranian bloc in parliament has more members than the pro-Iranian bloc in parliament. It's just that the anti-Iranian bloc in parliament is led by a person who is not a politician. This is Muqtada Sadr, who spends most of his time in his hometown of Kufa, tweeting, using the Twitter quite a lot, and he's not a politician. And the Iranian bloc in parliament, we're speaking about two Shiite blocs. Shiites are not made of one piece. The Iranian bloc is led by some master politicians, like Hadi al-Amiri or Nouri al-Maliki, former prime minister of Iraq. And that gives them a certain advantage right now, and more influence over Adil Abdul Mahdi. Adil Abdul Mahdi cannot form a government. He doesn't really have a cabinet. There is disagreement over two portfolios, the most important ones, interior and defense. And it is, many people expect him to resign because he would not be able to form a government within the appropriate time.
Mr. Javedanfar, to what degree does Abdul Mahdi have the backing of Iran, or is he more supported by Western powers?
Well, he went to visit Ayatollah Khamenei. It's very important, but if I'm not mistaken, he's also been to Saudi Arabia. He has good relations with the Saudis as well. He tries to balance the relations.
Yeah, they all do that
with the Saudis.
And with the Americans.
With the Americans is very important. The Iranians. the Iranian government, the Iranian regime, first of all, it's not a government issue. Government doesn't have much of an influence over Iraq. This is a regime file, the Iranian regime file, which consists of the Revolutionary Guard. For them, Iraq is the back. It's strategic depth. You know that the old Soviet Union talked about strategic depth. This is part of Iran's strategic depth now, going all the way into Iraq. And the importance of Iraq increased even more when ISIS, that the threat of ISIS loomed, and you know the Iraqis went to the Iranians, and they were the first ones there to send weapons to the Kurds, and to help the Iraqis. So that helped also, apart from the Shia background, despite the split with the Shia camp in Iraq. But to answer your question, Iran does have influence, but not as much as it wants to. There are other constraints within Iraq. We saw, the Iranians saw very well that there were demonstrations in Basra. They were shouting anti-Iran things. They attacked the Iranian consul.
Also in Baghdad.
And Iran does have, look, Iran has invested there. You know, this is one thing I have to say, if I can just have 1 minute to explain this. Iran is given these opportunities when there's discrimination against Shia around the region. Iran doesn't hold the gun to anybody's head in order to make them an ally. Iran becomes an attractive ally when the Shia are discriminated against. So I think this is an opportunity that they've exploited, but they've also not managed it very well, because now some of the Shia are anti-Iran.
Mr. Mitchell, how do you perceive this?
Well, I could say from on the ground, we were there last year during the referendum, the Kurdish referendum, that there was a lot of hope and optimism at the time. But for Kurds anyway, sadly, the referendum passed, but after that, they didn't get the backing of the United States like they had hoped for. I can talk about, say, a place called Bartilla. We were there back in 2014 after ISIS took over much of that region, a Christian town, and that time they were threatened by ISIS. But then we were back there last year. Now the town is threatened by Iranian influence, by Shiite militias, the Shiite mosques going in their schools. So many of the Christians there are not, several years ago they were afraid of ISIS. Now they're afraid of the Iranian influence growing in that region.
Mr. Oren, talking about the Shiite militias, especially the mobilization forces, obviously they have been growing and gaining ground alongside the Iraqi army. Now, lately they've been even bolstering their integration within the Iraqi army, fighting alongside the soldiers, literally, also on the border with Syria, where we see the al-Shabi, the mobilization forces, standing guard and actually claiming to be the most significant force to control that region, something that is also a concern for Israel and other Western allies here in the region. To what degree are they dictating the policy of Iraq?
What we see in Iraq over the last several years is something akin to the Lebanese model. In Lebanon, for the last several decades, 7 decades or so, we had a power-sharing model with a Christian president, a Sunni prime minister, and a Shiite Speaker of Parliament. In Iraq, we have a Kurdish president. This is Brahimi Saleh, who nominated Mahdi. We have a Shiite prime minister, and we have a Sunni Speaker of Parliament. But this is just the veneer of what is happening underneath. And underneath, just like Iran tried to export the revolution to Lebanon and succeeded via Hezbollah, a bit through Amal, but mostly Hezbollah. Here too, it has managed through various militias and parties and the infiltration of the popular mobilization units, which you mentioned, it managed to have at least a blocking influence. Now, Meir was right. Iran cannot dictate policy, but it can block someone else's policy. And we see it now regarding the oil sanctions. Because for President Trump, if there is no united front against Iran's oil exports, he is not going to get his wish of knocking the Iran economy under the table. And because he has given waivers to 8 countries, but most importantly, Iraq has asked, and within a few days we'll see whether it gets an extension. It has been given a 45 day waiver in early November, due to expire shortly. And because it gets its gas from Iran, the Iraqi economy cannot function if Trump insists on withdrawing this waiver.
Unless Turkish alternatives are brought forward.
But again, so he will have to give a concession to someone, and through this lever, the Iranians are managing to foil Trump's policy.
This actually brings up a very interesting question with regard to the U.S. sanctions on the Islamic Republic. Can those sanctions actually hold and provide the pressures needed if Iraq does not comply?
If Iraq does not comply. First of all, former Prime Minister Haider Abadi said that Iraq is going to comply. Adil Abdul Mahdi did not say anything different. He did not say that Iraq would comply, and he's now incumbent prime minister, but he did not say that Iraq would act against the sanctions or do something against the sanctions. In fact, the Iraqi market is now flooded by cheap Iranian products.
Not very high quality, though. I hear complaints.
Very low quality, I must say, especially the cars.
Turkish products.
Especially the cars. And the effect on the Iraqi market is detrimental. It's very, very bad. And most Iraqis would like to see a sort of an independence from this kind of economic flooding with tomatoes and cars and everything else. Actually, I think that Iran is... as the selling side needs the Iraqi market more than Iraq needs those Iranian products.
Mr. Javedanfar, as Mr. Mitchell has also indicated, the growing influence of the Shiites in different areas. Of course, we talked about shifting demographics, not only in Iraq, but also in Syria and other places where the mobilization forces have forced out a lot of the Sunni Muslim populations in order to bring the families of the Shiites and so on to establish a more contingent area from Iran to Iraq to Syria and Lebanon, of course. To what degree is this influence a growing trend? And you're talking about the cheap quality of those Iranian products being brought in. To what degree is that also a component in the matter of whether they should choose, on the one hand, the Iranian influence or Western and Turkish, for instance?
I'd just like to add the point that according to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, it was this Hezbollah were planning to allow some of the Iraqi militia to use some of the tunnels that were discovered in a future attack against the state of Israel. So it's not just that we're facing the Iraqi militia problem in Syria, in a future war in Lebanon we'll be facing, but how good they are, that's another issue, because I read an article that they get like 30 days of training. And in Israel, I don't think with 30 days of training you'd get anywhere near a front line, but that's another story. Look, in terms of Iran, I think the most if we want to talk about the most detrimental Iranian policy recently, I think Chris probably viewed it when he was in Kurdistan during the last September referendum. It was the shameful behavior of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, who basically evacuated Kirkuk without putting up a fight. Nothing. They just. I mean, I'm not a Kurd, and I'm embarrassed, you know. But I hear that they were threatened by the Iranians, so maybe they had good reason. I think that was a very, very detrimental. I mean, in terms of for Western interests, because a lot of people would have liked to have seen a more independent Kurdistan. They said.
So you're actually implying that Iran was involved in trying to devise the two major families of the Kurds in order to split them to a certain degree?
Everybody knows that Soleimania in Kurdistan is the PUK capital, which is the Iranians, which has very long tradition of support.
Maybe, Mr. Mitchell, would you like to elaborate?
No, I think he's right. I mean, it was sort of divide and conquer at that time, right after the referendum, and then there was a division within the Kurdish population and the governments, which undermined, any perhaps investment or diplomatic buttressing of the Kurds at that time. I have a question. I wonder, now that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in office, Rex Tillerson, at the time, the U.S. Secretary of State, didn't seem to have the backing of the Kurds. He didn't want to seem to back the Kurds. But to your point, I think that's there was a division within the Kurds that really undermined that whole referendum that passed by about 90%.
Well, the shift of the Secretary of States from Rex Tillerson to Mike Pompeo was a significant shift also in the American policy towards Iraq. Rex Tillerson being a big supporter of Baghdad and of Prime Minister at the time, al-Maliki, who their relationship was quite odd considering the fact that after a day or two that Tillerson met with Maliki, Maliki flew to Tehran to meet up with the Ayatollahs over there. To what degree is now the fact that Secretary Pompeo is in office, to what degree does that actually shift the opinion or the attitude of the Washington administration towards Baghdad?
Well, obviously, the Secretary of State is one of the 2 or 3 most influential policymakers regarding national security and foreign policy, after the president and along the national security advisor, in this case, John Bolton. The problem is President Trump is not that stable in his tenure. He is now engulfed in domestic and legal troubles, and one cannot be sure of his stamina and commitment to global affairs, including to the Middle East. Now, you may say that this leaves a vacuum which a proactive guy like Mike Pompeo, a former West Pointer, former director of Central Intelligence, strong-willed, had his 12 demands to Iran, obviously a different persona than Rex Tillerson was. So Pompeo can do a lot, but he must be backed up by his president, and it is too early to know whether Trump will.
Even though a good leader puts good people around him, and in this case, it seems like he's doing a good job.
Yes, but the Trumpian worldview is isolationist. It calls from withdrawing from the Middle East and into Fortress America, America first. Now, he has been prevailed upon by the Pentagon up to now regarding the military presence in Syria. And Syria and Iraq are part and parcel of the same fight against ISIS. This is still top priority. Mm-hmm. And the Americans wouldn't like either ISIS or Al-Qaeda to reestablish themselves in Syria or in Iraq or in the region which is between both, even though it belongs to Iraq, Anbar province, eastern Syria, western Iraq. So to that extent, the Americans are going to stay the course. But whether they will be there in order to support the Iraqi government, and mind you, the Iranians are allied with the Americans against ISIS, against Daesh. So it's too complicated to make a call right now regarding Pompeo's influence over Iraqi policy.
Somewhat of a peculiar alliance. Dr. Zeidel, how do you comment on this?
On the peculiar alliance between whom?
The United States and Iran vis-a-vis the Islamic State?
Well, the fight against the Islamic State has been going on, and I must say that the United States does not really need Iran. Iran never actually took an active part in this fight when there was real fighting in Iraq between 2014 and 2017. Qasem Soleimani was just having photo opportunities and was doing more damage than really helping the Iraqis. And effectively, it was not the Hashd al-Sha'bi or any Iranian paramilitary unit which fought the IS out of third of Iraq. It was Iraqi units, or counterterrorism units, very effective, very professional, and the Iraqi army, of course, who did the job. And they continue to do the job. And in the other side of the border in Syria, where you still have a very small enclave of ISIS, which has been reduced over the last couple of days when SDF forces, Kurdish forces led by or trained by the Americans, took over the small town of Hajin. The Americans also take a lead as part of the coalition, and I don't see the Russians there, and I don't see the Iranians there, and Hashd al-Sha'bi, which, as you said, are very bad soldiers, just man the ground. That's what they are doing.
To this
They do border
specific
policing.
situation, actually, the mobilization forces, Mr. Oren, they have been complaining about the Americans actually targeting them on the Iraq-Syria border when the U.S.-backed forces are attacking the Islamic State, where the United States actually doesn't differentiate between the Islamic State and the Iranian-backed militias.
Because the Americans have learned their lessons, they were naive at first when they started operating against the Islamic State, and then they saw that their erstwhile allies become their enemies and transform themselves into partners and enemies at will. So the Americans are less discriminate now.
Mr. Javedanfar, both you and Dr. Zeidel have indicated that the Shiite militias haven't had a lot of training. They're not very professional, not very capable. Nevertheless, they have a lot of influence on areas, and they're very famous for brutality. Every time they entered a village, there were horrendous stories of massacre and other elements, whether it be Sunni or Christian or other Yazidi tribes in the area. To what degree does this Iranian influence is more of a PR based on specific incidences of brutality rather than actually being capable of influencing full force?
You mean, is Iran in charge of the brutality of the
Indeed.
Sha'bi? I don't know. But the Iranians are certainly aware of it, because if you and I can read about it in Reuters, the Iranians certainly know about it. Are the Iranians doing something to tone it down, or by all accounts, they're still continuing to do what they're doing, Hashd al-Sha'bi? Look, for the Iranians, I don't think there is any interest right now to tone it down, because who's going to stand up against them? Who, the Sunnis are going to stand up against them in Iraq? They're not going to do that. I think they're just going to continue with the old strategy of fitting geography to population, before, to depopulate geographic areas so that the geography becomes more geopolitically more attuned to Iran's geopolitical and geostrategic needs in the region. Well, I don't think in the future they're going to do anything. I think what they need is for the Hashd al-Sha'bi to be there. They don't have great fighting skills, but they make up the numbers.
Mr. Mitchell?
No, it's exactly. They're on the ground. They have the boots on the ground, and if they don't have any, if they're not professional soldiers or not, that's really irrelevant. They're the people that control and influence that particular region. We interviewed one of the commanders up there in that area, as I was talking about Bartilla, and so they're the influence in that particular region. And demographically, I think that's part of the strategy of Iran to shift the demographics. They're doing that in Syria as well. There's documents of trying to depopulate certain areas and infiltrate or bring in Shiite families as well. So a demographic change is happening throughout the region.
Mr. Owen, to what degree does this demographic change actually provide the United States with incentives to actually stay in the region, or is it just something that they see happening and just let it go?
Well, as they used to say at the Pentagon, we don't do nation building, or at least we don't do it anymore. The main mistake 15 years ago, and this, by the way, comes out of the testimony of retired General John Abizaid, who was the deputy CENTCOM commander during the invasion, then became the commanding officer of CENTCOM, and now has been nominated as the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And he has said that in the planning towards the Iraq war, the idea was not to dismantle the entire Ba'athist machinery, but only the top, which was obviously personally loyal to Saddam Hussein. But the Garner government transition or provisional government made away with all of the Ba'athists, which are mostly Sunni, and you can't put Humpty Dumpty back.
We're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing sentence. Dr. Zeidel, we'll start with you.
I would like to say that I'm not really concerned by demographic changes because demographic changes are minimal. We don't see settlement. We don't see Shiization by moving populations into the heartland of Sunni Iraq. Doesn't happen. Certainly doesn't happen in Kurdistan. Iraq is actually built around a certain separation between the components, and the separation is being kept. If the separation is infringed upon, then I will be worried. But I want to say that the Hashd Shabi, well, there was quite a lot of exaggeration about what they were doing, and there was quite a lot of fear that they might do what they didn't do because they were not sent into the front lines between 2014 and 2017. But the real damage is the terror that they inflict, not in Sunni Iraq, but in Baghdad.
Mr. Javedanfar?
Well, I'd like to finish with the question. If the Iranian regime were to disappear tomorrow and Iran is run by secular isolationist government or regime, will the Shia question in the Middle East disappear? I'm not sure it will. I think now that we have the situation of the awakening of the Shia who were so discriminated against for so many generations, now in Iraq, in Syria, I think will remain. In Lebanon, Hezbollah will be poorer, but I don't think you can just shove the Shia under the carpet again or into the bottle again. So I think this is an issue that goes now. Iran is part of it, but I think it goes beyond Iran.
Mr. Mitchell?
Two things, I guess. One would be was there an opportunity lost after the Kurdish referendum a year ago for the U.S. to back the Kurds? Second thing, about the future of the Iranian regime. I know there's economic turmoil, political turmoil, and one other thing, there's a Christian revival going on within Iran right now, and whether or not these things
But you could get arrested for it. You could get arrested if you become a Christian in Iran. If you're born a Christian, you're okay. But if you convert to Christianity, you're arrested.
Death penalty.
Yeah. No,
true,
not
but-
death penalty. No.
Death
Really?
penalty,
I've
yes.
never
Well,
heard.
there's stories of many. NPR did a story just the other day. Many Iranian believers or Iranians becoming Christians.
Mr. Oren?
Two Israeli angles. One, what is happening in Western Iraq is of concern to the Israeli defense establishment. If there are Iranian or pro-Iranian militias with missiles there aimed at Israel, it's a problem, and Israel is acting against it. And the other one, Iraq is the only Arab country to have fought Israel in 1948 and not signed the armistice agreement. It's time for them to do it.
Inshallah.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Zeidel, Mr. Oren, Mr. Mitchell, and Mr. Javedanfar for being here today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you again next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.